Hey everybody, welcome back for another episode of Stonks on Rails. In this episode, I'm going to be continuing my conversion of my legacy stock screening application and refactoring it so that it has a much better front end using turbo stimulus and a better organization of the templates. And in this episode, I'm going to focus on how to handle what I call enterprise scale data. And what exactly do I mean by that? Well, a lot of examples that you see out there when you're learning programming, and in particular like web application development, are very simplistic examples using very small bits of data. So a lot of sample applications, they'll show you how to build like a blog or some type of a message board type of application where you just have a few text fields and maybe just a little bit of metadata associated with that. When you're doing a business logic application, the situations that you're dealing with are often a lot more complex and involved a lot more data and nested data. And in my stock scanning application, we have all of this information about stocks, particular stocks, and related data to them, and a history going back for about 10 years. And I have gigabytes worth of this information. And also importantly, I have reports. Well, they're actually SQL queries that I call reports that process all of that information, and they aggregate that into output that I display on my screen. And that's what helps me do a much better screening for stocks that I'm interested in trading. So this is kind of like enterprise data. It doesn't have as much nesting as you do in some of the business type of problems, but it does have data complexity involving a lot of different data types. So I'm going to kind of show you how I deal with that level of complexity and how I'm going to restructure my front end templates to be a lot more workable and expandable. So here's a look at the application that I'm converting. And what I'm going to be trying to convert here is this 52-week report. And I'm just going to be converting this chart for this episode. There's other features that I want to have, like the mark reviewed button. There's some different actions I could take for screening, and I'll save this stuff for a future video, as well as the date filtering. But what I want to do is I want to refactor the code that goes into the database and builds this table that we see right here. Now, to get a better context of exactly what this program is and the process that I'm going for converting the legacy application, which is written in Rails 4.2, into the new application, which is going to be a refactored version of this program using Rails 7 and the hot-worded framework, I suggest that you take a look at the previous video that I made where I show how I began this particular project. Also, if you want to check out the code and follow along with me, then you're more than welcome to by joining my Patreon and signing up for a subscription there, where once you sign up as a member, I'll give you access to my GitHub repository and you could download the repo yourself. Let's go ahead and take a look at the path for how this legacy report is being made, and then I'll show you the refactored version. So we have the 52 weeks high route, as you can see there in the browser, and that corresponds to my routes file, namespace reports, week 52 highs. Well, actually, the way that I ended up doing the refactoring, I focused on the 52 weeks lows first, but it doesn't matter. We could go into the reports controller, take a look at this 52-week lows report. Both the 52-week highs and 52-week lows are built using basically copy-pasted code. So I define the fields that I'm going to be using here. So these fields later tell the template which ones to display, and for different reports I have different fields that show up. I build the line items using this interactor here called 52-week low. So if we go into that, we'll see that I call convert hash keys, and I'm doing includes here for the functionality that's calling this, like this convert hash keys. But in the refactored version, rather than using mix-ins, I decided to just use class inheritance, as you'll see here in a minute. So this convert hash keys actually comes from the common mix-in, and what it does is it takes the result of a SQL query that's run and it does a conversion on all of that information to make them specific data types that we want. This Verbalize action here, this is actually an interactor class, and it's a third-party library that I used to use in one of my previous companies I worked at. And basically what it does is it kind of gives you an API for setting up an interactor class, but I don't really need this anymore, so this is one of the things I'm getting rid of in the refactored version. So anyway, going back to the application, we have the run query, and I have this select 52-week lows, and what this does is it actually runs a SQL query. And here I've got actual raw SQL in my program. It takes this text, it takes the most recent date, plugs it in right here, and runs this entire query on the database. So you have the run query here, which has the report data. So going back to the controller, we have those line items. There's a filtering stage here, which I have inside the controller, and then it does a sort here on those line items. And then it builds this report object. It splits up the data into sections. So some of the reports I have, like going back to this application, like the active report, I have this split into gainers and losers. You know, do I really want to continue doing that? Adds a little bit of complexity. Yeah, I guess I could. So I'm going to retain the sections feature, but yeah, this does that splitting up of the report into different sections. Most of them only have one section, and then it moves on to the report template. And it's interesting, I notice I have like a lot of isolated files here, like active stocks, range, and I think these were all reports that I was using, and I think this is all dead code now, some of these files, because I think what I did was I consolidated all the renders into just the report template. So this report template is now the main template now. And as you can see here, there's a flash notice that could appear if I'm displaying a notification message. As you can see here, this is the last updated, and it gives you the count of the items, which corresponds to this section right up here. This box corresponds to this area here. The report date form corresponds to this date filter right there. And then you can see the report sections breakdown. We have this report table, which is the actual table being built. One thing I want to show you about this report table partial is that it is really messy. As you can see here, I have a lot of if statements, conditional logic, and I have these stylings here right inside of the template when I could just be using a class for a lot of these and including the style information there, but I'm setting the width on the actual template line. And there's also a bunch of conditional logic too for formatting the text that appears, which is not really a best practice in front-end templates for Ruby on Rails. So the legacy app I have here in the orange on top, and I'm going to show you the comparison of this code to the new code, which I have in green here. And I'm going to walk you through the refactored version of what I have done in the green. So here's a report in the new application. As you can see here, I don't have everything quite working yet. I'm missing the actions I could have to hide things from the report and change their colors. This filtering, does this even work? No, this filtering doesn't work yet. I just copied that over. And right now I just have 52 weeks lows. Yeah, I only have the 52-week highs working. Oh, that looks weird. This is the bare bones work in process right now. So we'll start out here on the same path. If you notice, I'm using scope instead of namespace to set the route for the reports. And it's a very subtle difference, but the main reason for that is with the Rails helper paths, I could prefix them with report instead of reports like I do with namespace. Design-wise, one of the things I'm trying to do this time around is I'm trying to keep my controller logic light. So I've compacted all of this logic that you see here inside the controller. I'm trying to push it down into just this 52-week low interactor. So most of this stuff like the fields and the line item sorting and the section dividing, I shifted that into the interactor class that builds the whole report. And so basically you're just calling this and then passing that entire report object down to the render show template. Inside of the interactor class, I've taken some of the logic that was split into the different mixins, and I'm including them inside of the class now. And I'm using more of a hierarchical structure. So the report fields here are defined inside of the class. I have a report type variable that's defined inside the class. We'll use this to reference which class that we're in. And I have the SQL query to be run inside the class as a method that could be called. Now I'm going to be doing this for every single report following the same structure, and they're descended from report build base now. And in report build base, I have a basic call parameter, and this interactor is actually descended from callable service base, which sets up a class method for call so that you could call without having to do new.call. So here the report line items are built using this build line item structs, and this is the equivalent of that convert hash keys. And what it does is it takes the SQL result of that particular query, which is executed in raw SQL, and it does those conversions I mentioned for the data types that we want. Down here, as you can see, query SQL, this raises an error if you try to call it without defining it. So you shouldn't directly instantiate report build base here. You have to have a descendant class like I have with this 52-week low class here, which descends from that. Now, one of the key differences here in the build line item structs, now instead of uses a hash, uses a line item struct, which is a predefined data structure of what you could have inside of this thing. So one of the things about Ruby that is really dangerous and kind of annoying for me at times is the use of hashes. Ruby is very unstructured because it lacks strong data types. You could create a hash that contains all sorts of junk in it. When you're in a very complex program and you're passing through hashes of really complex data, you may not exactly know what to expect in each type of hash that you're passing around. You could try to end up referencing hash keys or arrays inside of a given object, assuming that they're there, and they may not be there, and then you'll get an undefined error. You get an invalid key or something like that. By using structs, it allows you to more formally define what goes into a data type. It doesn't strongly type these things, so like these different values like last trade or gap percent could have any type of data in it, but at least you have this definition now that you could use as documentation to go to have a good idea of what to expect inside of this class. And you could use these just like regular classes. So I have these conversion routines inside of the struct, like money as string, and that has certain things that helps us do the conversions to more readable formats for the reports themselves. And as you can see here, I have this as string method, and this is going to be really useful later on, is the struct itself could take a particular field in it and run the data type conversion to display the data as you would want on the report. So this struct could also double as a presenter class too. So going back to look at this code here, for each line returned by the SQL query, we wrap it inside of this line item struct structure, and then the line items get built into the container. And this build container is something that we could override if we're going to be building a report with different sections like the active stocks report. But this super level container struct is going to have the line items in it as sections. Okay, so they're going to be wrapped into sections. We have the build sections. You're going to have basically your line items 3 levels deep. You're going to have the container struct, which has metadata for the overall report. You're going to have each section for the report, and then you're going to have your line items. So now let's go take a look at the show template. So by the way here, I did a lot of copy paste. I'm going to get rid of some of these files. So we have the show. I have a report header being built. And now I just have one variable being passed down into the templates. And that variable is named @report. As I kind of mentioned in a previous video, one of the design patterns I like to follow is if I could get away with it, I'll only use one instance variable per template rendering. And in this case, it's called report. So let's take a look at report header. And this is going to have our date and line item count. And I'm probably going to put some of the filters in here later on. Report table. Right now, I just have it called report table new. And this is a much simplified structure that's more dynamic, makes use of Ruby's meta programming. And this small slice of code here replaces this really messy, difficult to read structure here. And like I said before, I'm relying on the class names to have some of this information like the styling. So if we look here, the table head, rather than having a separate line item for each row on the report that I'm going to conditionally show, what I do is I use the report fields. And remember, let's look at where the report fields are defined in that interactor class. Here, report base, report fields. All right, so report field service. And I'm passing the report field structure there. This is abstract. This has to be defined in this descendant class. So we go to 52-week low here. We look at report fields. That's where that information is. So the information that I had here in the controller, I'm no longer defining in the controller, but I'm defining it in this class here, which has all the information that you need for building the report. And I have report field service. What does that do? Well, report field service, for one, it kind of acts on a chat for the available fields that could show up on report. So it does a little bit of filtering on them, but importantly, it takes these field titles here. So if you have each report field as a Ruby symbol, what the report field symbol service would do is it would translate that into the appropriate header for the report column. So ticker symbol, that gets translated to the text symbol. Last trade gets translated to the text last. And here's what this looks like in action. See how they're corresponding. So in this refactor, there's a lot more jumping around that you have to do in the code. But the advantage of this is that the code base itself is smaller and it's more consolidated, and things are organized in a much better categorical sense for what they're doing. So like this 52-week low interactor, this just has the specific information, what makes this report special basically, which is the SQL query and the fields to display. All of the logic is consolidated, that's uniform in all the reports, is consolidated here into the base class. And inside of the actual templates, we have much less code because it's dynamic. And that way, if I want to change like one thing that's uniform across all of the reports, I could just make a small tweak to some of the logic here and get big results. And I don't have to go through changing a whole bunch of stuff like you would see here. So when you have code written like this, it gets very hard to maintain that sort of program because you have to modify everything and search, find, and replace here. Whereas this type of structure gives you a lot more leverage for changing stuff. Now, there's kind of downsides to writing your code efficient like this, because if you have like a lot of one-off sort of things, you might have to figure out a new way of building like some type of a service class to handle certain things, kind of like what I do with the container, the report service here, or building like the container thing to have additional metadata. Basically, if you need more detail, you build more layers to the application. And that's kind of like how I'm designing my apps now as a more seasoned Ruby developer versus this sort of code I did when I was still new at it. So I think that's enough detail for this one video. It's a little bit different from some of the other videos I did just because I'm covering so much and it's a little bit unstructured, which is kind of ironic because I'm adding structure to a legacy program. But I think in this video you kind of get to see how I evolved as a Ruby developer, whereas some of my older code was a little sloppy. It had a lot of copy-pasted chunks. What I'm doing now is I'm consolidating some very messy code and more categorically grouping things in together into areas that they make sense so that you could find all of the relevant data for one particular piece of business logic in the same place, which might be inside of a particular class or inside of a particular data structure. And some of the ways that I'm doing that is I'm using very much the Ruby Struct type of class to help me define what goes into a data object, which makes processing complex data a lot easier. I hope that kind of makes sense, and I encourage you to take a look at the code itself and do some thinking about it. And you could do that by signing up for my Patreon subscription. Give me your GitHub username. I'll get you into the private repo, and you could experiment with this code yourself and kind of see how I'm structuring it. So this video was kind of difficult to talk about just because there's a lot of structure to show. I hope I did a good job of it. Let me know what you think in the comments. And I got more Ruby on Rails content for you on the way. See you next time.